What did Jesus feel the day he died? What did he experience? What happened to Jesus the day he died?
You're watching Timeless Talks, timeless subjects, information for life.
Isaiah 53 was written about 700 years before the actual passion of the Christ occurred. It is so vivid. It's like Isaiah took a pad and pen and went walking through the streets of Jerusalem, observing and writing things down concerning the passion of the Christ. And when he got finished, when he ran back to the newspaper, told the editor, "Stop the presses, stop the presses." He ran over and very passionately wrote the story that he had just witnessed, using words that we can see and we can almost feel. But what does it say? What really did happen to Jesus? We're going to examine that question by, first of all, looking to what happened to him emotionally and mentally. Then we will examine what happened to him physically according to this passage. First, let's examine the idea of what happened to him emotionally. We don't have to read but just a few verses down to verse 3, and we find the idea of him being despised and rejected. You got to remember that we're talking about God's Son, but he's not viewed by the leadership of the religion as God's Son. He's not seen as God in the flesh. As a matter of fact, they had incredible contempt for him. They saw him as someone not worthy of any kind of respect. Do you remember how they treated him on the cross? Well, you remember those soldiers were sitting at the cross and they might have been throwing dice for it. For what? For his clothes. He was on the cross naked because they're gambling for the clothes. They don't have much thought about him, do they? And then the Bible talks about how that he is a man of sorrows. Remember, he came down from heaven and he taught so many people, and yet so much of the time they rejected his own teachings. But then when Jesus had just concluded the great triumphant entry into Jerusalem a few days before he died, he looked across over there at the city of Jerusalem on that hillside, and he looked at it and he began to cry. And he says, "Oh, how often would I have gathered you like a chicken gathers her chicks under her wing, and yet you would not." They rejected him, and that left him with a constant sorrow. He was also a man acquainted with grief. Now, grief in the original language had to do with diseases. Let's suppose that you were a leper. You were completely isolated from all people. Not like a COVID isolation for 10 or 12 days or maybe a couple of weeks. No, you are permanently isolated. That's what grief is. Verse 3 also talks about how that people hid their faces from him. The people who were executing Jesus and dealing with Jesus the night he was betrayed and the next day saw Jesus as such an awful, bad person. They literally just turned their backs on him and didn't have anything to do with him. They were also people that hid their faces from him because he was so badly beaten. It was hard to look at a man that had been beaten that bad. They didn't have a stomach for it. Isaiah also talks about someone who has not been esteemed. We esteemed him not, it says. Yes, he is God's son. And Jesus has been one who always was about doing the work that his Father wanted him to do. And yet, his own people did not accept him. They thought him as valueless. He was unimportant. We, we might be saying, well, he don't count. Remember something else about Jesus too. They cleared their throats and spit on him. How would all this make you feel emotionally? Well, Isaiah wasn't done. Verse 8 in the book of Isaiah talks about how that Jesus received judgment. His trial, well, I'm not sure I'd even call it a trial. It was illegal as it could be. They had all kinds of things wrong with it. It was not to ever be held at night, yet they had it at night. And then when that court was finished, they carried him to Pilate, and Pilate didn't make the decision. He let the crowd decide what to do with Jesus. Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. Jesus, the very giver of life, is being sentenced by both courts to immediate execution. What would that do to anyone's emotional state? And yet, verse 11 has got the culminating phrase. Talks about him being of anguish of soul. He was rejected by the people that day. He was rejected by his own followers. He was rejected by the rulers of the Jewish nation. He was rejected by the Roman people. He was completely alone. And then you top on top of that all are the feelings of our guilt and our pain. Jesus felt our anxieties over the things we've done wrong. He understood our pain. When you put it all together, he had anguish of soul. All this put together, that's just the mental side. So now, let's look at the physical side of what happened to Jesus. Isaiah described the physical torture in verse 4 as stricken, smitten by God. God was punishing Jesus because of all the transgressions and all the iniquities of the world that we talked about in our last video. But God is not doing the punishment directly. He is using the people of Jesus' own day. And Jesus just got punched over and over and over. Remember, the Romans hated all Jews. And Jesus was the king of the Jews. What do you think they're going to do to him? And how much of it are they going to do? There's a similar word found over in verse 5. It's the word crushed. The original Hebrew word found there meant to beat to pieces. Remember the movie that you've watched, The Passion of the Christ. And if you haven't watched it, you certainly need to do so. Remember, look at his face. The eye is closed from the beatings. It's a really accurate picture of what happened to Jesus. The next word is pretty tough too. It's the idea of piercing. Verse 5. This is not piercing for jewelry. This is piercing with large nails that will cause death. Jesus' hands and his feet were all nailed to the cross. They did so he would not fall off. And yet it was on that cross he would, with his hands up, he couldn't breathe. So he'd pull up, strain, and get a few quick breaths. And then he was being so exhausted, he just sat. But he can't breathe down here. So he'd pull up again. And everyone crucified went through this same horrible, torturous way. Most people got to breathe about 12 times a minute. He's going to do this for more than 3 hours. Many people who crucified finally, because of the exhaustion, just couldn't go no more. They'd sag and then pass out. and then just die. There's one other word that is talked about in verse 5. It's the word wounded. There's a scene in the Passion of the Christ in which Jesus is being scourged. They take him and they tie him to a short post, and then they flog him and they beat him. And I remember so clearly how that when they took that cat of nine tails and they threw it over him, it stuck in his side, and they ripped it back out, leaving big gashes and huge wounds. Wounds. And the final word I'm going to bring to you is that of oppression. The Jewish religious leadership hated him. The Romans, because he was a Jew, hated him. And they were literally going to make him pay. That's what the word means. They're going to make him pay. Pay for all the embarrassment they've had because of his teachings. Make him pay for disrupting their wonderful way of living. Make him pay because he's a Jew. And they whipped him. And they scourged him. And he was even lying in his own pool of blood. And then they had him carry a cross. And then they whipped him to make him go down the trail and up the hill. He did so till he physically couldn't go anymore and fell under the weight of it. Listen, when you're oppressed, you're not receiving any mercy. When you're oppressed, there is no compassion. Isaiah has described for you today what happened to Jesus. They're horrible pictures. It makes us hurt inside. It creates mental anguish. And he did all of this for your good. But understand something very important. God does have tremendous love for you. And the whole thing is a demonstration of his intense love. But God's love will not go unrequited. God does expect something from you. Now, what he expects, well, it's too big for this talk. So here's what we're going to do. Here's an email address, info@. Write for information about this particular talk. Let us know. And let us be able to start a conversation with you to show you what God expects from you. And you can have joy again. And you can have peace again. And you can have a grand relationship with God the Father. And it can begin right now with that email. Which of the words we've talked about today has the greatest impact on you? We'd like for you, if you would, please write it, or maybe a short collection, them, in the comments. That'd be helpful to you and to others. Or maybe you know someone who needs to see this. You know, there's a share button here somewhere. Find it and put it on your page. Or if you're watching on Facebook, tag them. If you happen to be watching this on YouTube, we hope that you'll look over here to the side, find our logo, click it, and subscribe to our channel. There's just one more thing I need to tell you. There's one more video in this series. Thank you for watching. And until next time, goodbye for now.